This is our last seminar before the summer break, and I'm really delighted to have SarahJilani, Dr. SarahJilani, here to talk to us today about cultural production and the crisis of consciousness. So Sarah, I'm just going to do like a little kind of bio just to kind of introduce you, and then you can kind of take over from there. So Sarah's a lecturer in English at City St George's University in London, and teaches undergraduate and postgraduate Anglophone post-colonial literatures and world film with a focus on race and gender and the legacies of colonialism. So Sarah's also a widely published cultural journalist on contemporary art, books and film, and regularly contributes to The Economist, to The Times, Art Review, and is a BBC Radio 4, BBC AHC New Generation thinker. So Sarah's research includes subjectivity, political consciousness, and the living legacies of colonialism and literatures and cinemas of Africa and Asia. And Sarah's published on a wide range of topics, including neocolonialism in Francophone West African cinema and women's writing about the Nigerian Civil War. And Sarah recently published a monograph in 2024, which was about subjectivity and decolonisation in the post-independence novel and film, and that was with Edinburgh University Press. So Sarah's born and raised in Istanbul, holds a degree in English from the Universities of York, Cambridge, and a PhD as well. So yeah, I'm really delighted that Sarah's kind of here today. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah, and then Sarah's going to talk for around about kind of 30 minutes, and then after that we'll kind of take some questions and kind of carry on the conversation from there. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much for that intro, Jez, and thank you to everyone who showed up online and in person. I'm really sorry I can't be there in Leeds today, but I really appreciate your time. So as Jez mentioned, my first monograph, Subjectivity and Decolonization in the Post-Independence Novel and Film, was concerned with a question at once historical, political, and psychic. How can we understand the relationship between decolonization and subjectivity? I tried to theorize in it a materialist approach with the help of Frantz Fanon's thought to essentially subjectivity in the context of the end of colonialism. And as a literature and film scholar, I argued post-independence novels and films from Africa and South Asia, so that's broadly 1950s to the 1980s, helped me argue that Fanon's dialectical idea or conceptualization of subjectivity helps us understand the relationship between structural and psychic processes of decolonization. And by extension, it's what Bayodun Jayefo has called the arrest of decolonization in the 20th century. It was understood at the time as national sovereignty over economic, political, social, and cultural life. So before I begin, I just wanted to get into a few definitions. I'm very happy to discuss the many other definitions within which decolonization is currently put to use in the Q&A time. I know that that is an ongoing topic, but I just wanted to flag that my use of the term throughout today's presentation refers to the material process of dismantling the legacies of colonialism. So within a materialist tradition like that of the revolutionary Fanon, the cultural dimensions of decolonization, which we often hear about, it is often the focus of the school of decoloniality, or what's called decolonial theory. Those dimensions are understood and were understood at the time by a lot of these thinkers to be already couched within this broader material project. So emerging throughout my work was that subjectivity was the primary terrain where the suppression of or transformation towards political consciousness was played out in cultural representation, in storytelling, in narrative that is visual and textual. So today, that already raises a lot of questions and undefined words. So today I'm going to delve into, well, what is the relationship between visual culture in particular and subjectivity that was emerging in this work? And then I'm going to try to give some more definition to the notion of consciousness and consciousness raising, using the guidance of figures of the mid-century, 20th century of decolonization, like Fanon, Aimé Césaire, Steve Biko. And then we're going to delve into a wonderful Ghanaian novel published in 1969 to have a look at what I am trying to define as the various aspects of an aesthetics of political consciousness. What are the methods and the tools that Aikwe Arma and the Lebanese filmmaker Heini Sroor's texts show us about the certain fundamental elements of stories that are geared towards raising our consciousness, as will be defined through Fanon and Césaire. So I'm hoping by the time we get to the presentation, section 5, the ongoing relevance of this will be very, very obvious, but we'll still think about what some of the contemporary manifestations of these questions are. So no shade, but let's have a look at what our visual world looks like for most of us today. I was on Netflix, as many of us are, and I looked at what the algorithm was recommending me. And I was really struck by the limitations and the caliber of the things that I was being sold. Now, I know that visual culture is also just entertainment and fun, but this really struck me. We have three stories that are entirely about the monarchy. Out of all of this, I think Mad Men is probably a masterpiece, but it is about consumerism as success. We've got something that is essentially settling the Midwest of the US from mostly the settler colonials' perspectives as a kind of adventure and proving of masculinity. We have at least two stories, both very popular, that are about the ins and outs of aristocrats who very conveniently fall in love with other fellow aristocrats who will secure their class positions. We do have a real life story of a African-American woman who lived in the early 1900s. The story tells us that you can overcome racism if you're a good businesswoman. And then we've got other manifestations of masculinity as wealth and high-powered career. So we do have every day certain messaging in our visual cultures around what we should be prioritizing, who the protagonists in our stories are, and the dramas that are worth our time, mostly those of the upper class, and dramas that essentially are never depicted on screen and never infiltrate the kind of stories that we're discussing and watching as a collective. And I use this example given how many subscriptions Netflix has around the world. So there certainly is at least millions and millions of people who are encountering the curated works on that platform. This is not simply about entertainment. When we go back to essentially how cinema in particular first came into formerly colonized geographies, we see that it was a very important part of speaking to colonized subjects. We can see that in British colonies, in Africa in particular, but other places as well, a mobile film show was founded, and it was part of a bigger project to use new forms of film and spaces to administer, control, and maintain a very rapidly changing British Empire, changed also by the new technology of visual aesthetics like cinema. In London, there was a colonial film unit, and it was set up in 1939, so almost near the end of the British Empire, but they didn't assume that it would be so quite at that point. And it was disbanded relatively late on the cusp of widespread independences from the late 1950s onwards. The first independence from British colonial rule in Africa was, of course, Ghana in 1957, then called the Gold Coast. Within that tiny segment of time during which Britain was at war and was spending heavily on warfare, there still was deemed to be enough of an importance to film in colonies to produce over 200 films in this very exceptional and already expensive time frame for Britain. This was not any different when it came to French colonies in Africa. France's anxieties about the power of film in shaping public opinion was immediately revealed when they passed a colonial decree called Le Décret Laval, named after Laval. And this decree sought to control the content of films that were shot in Africa, in Francophone, mostly Francophone West Africa, and to minimize the creative roles played by Africans in the makings of films. France had opened cinemas and movie theaters in Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali for a few years now, as early as film really came to be. But they were very, very careful to essentially make sure that French aid for culture for Africans to make their own films existed independently from the commercial distribution system they'd set up. Those films, what got showed in theaters in West Africa was under the joint monopoly of two French companies. And it was very interesting and consequential for our thinking today that they excluded African films from West African commercial screens. They flooded the West African market with Hollywood Westerns and other B-grade European films, but they did cultivate the occasional African auteur in order to show that person's films back in the art house circuit at Cannes and other film festivals. So they wanted African filmmakers, but only for art house Western audiences. Interesting to note that Africans should not, in their colonial mentality, be watching stories by African directors. This is directly linked to what a lot of thinkers on colonialism, and Fanon as a psychiatrist and a revolutionary, a leader among those who did think on it, the epistemic and psychological dimensions of colonialism. And I'm keen today to sustain this this point within the material process of decolonization, right? Fanon understood that cultural violence, which is where the psychology of the colonized subjects develops in relation to these kinds of visual and textual stories that the colonizer allows them to see, was a kind of epistemic violence that contributed directly to the main project of colonialism, which for Fanon, as for many, was undoubtedly that of wealth theft. Fanon said in Toward the African Revolution, a collection of essays, we witness the destruction of cultural values, of ways of life, language, dress, techniques are devalorized. The social panorama is destroyed. Values are flaunted, crushed, emptied. A new system of values is imposed. So to think on the rather incredible idea that in the midst of the Second World War, Britain and France were spending lots of money to make films to show in their African colonies, gives us an idea already of how important these epistemic and psychopolitical dimensions to colonialism were to sustain that wealth accumulation. Sharifi and Chabot, two critics who have written on Fanon's epistemology, put it in the following helpful way. The third dimension of violence is epistemic, cultural, and psychological. In this dimension, the structure of colonial violence produces its own hegemonic superstructure, culture, with the help of books, newspapers, schools, texts, advertisements, films, and radio. This cultural production slowly and subtly penetrates the body and the mind, shaping subjectivities. In many ways, my first book was trying to figure out exactly how this penetration happens and what our avenues of shaping ourselves out of these legacies are. So given that this epistemic violence was such an important part of colonialism that Britain and France could spend time, money, and bureaucratic power to sustain it through cinema, even in the midst of World War II, tells us that consciousness raising was a very important aspect of decolonizing the entire continents that were colonized. One of the major unfinished projects, in fact, of decolonization, understood, as I mentioned, as national sovereignty over political, economic, social, and cultural life, was a crisis in consciousness raising. And I define this as a crisis because consciousness raising was understood at the time in that era of independence, 1950s, 60s, 70s, to be intimately related to what we discussed in the previous slide, to intimately related to literary, audiovisual, and other forms of cultural production. Key to the various visions of anti-colonial thinkers, such as Amilcar Cabral, who led the struggle against Portuguese rule in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, to Steve Biko in South Africa, to Thomas Sankara, who revolutionized independent Burkina Faso, was this idea that a politically conscious people meant truly lasting change. They all called it various things. We see that Sankara called it reconditioning our people's minds to accept themselves as they are, to be proud even. We saw Fanon write about a skillfully injected series of what he called inferiority complexes and how to come out of that. Fanon called that said that these were first economic, then, in his words, epidermal. So he did maintain that people weren't simply held back because they felt inferior. He maintained that one of the functions of the economic system, that is imperialism, was to internalize these kinds of ideas in order to facilitate its wealth accumulation. Because we mustn't forget that space and place were the objects of colonial domination, but the reformation of minds was where subjectivities could be and were shaped. Perhaps some of you may have heard of Thomas Macaulay's famous Minute on Indian Education. He's an officer, a colonial officer, who wrote a note in 1835 recommending back to London that English literary education in India would create what he called Indians in blood and color who are English in tastes and intellect. France had a dedicated commission for overseas cinema in West Africa for similar purposes. So the psychopolitical tools for what Fanon called, quote, hammering into the heads of the indigenous population that if the colonist were to leave, they would regress into barbarism, degradation, and bestiality, were incredibly important means of producing and reproducing colonialism. I love how Fanon always gives us a very literal visual, hammering into our heads. And that is where consciousness raising came to the fore in decolonization, knowing that these wrong ideas, these inferiority complexes, had been hammered into people's heads, decolonization had to address how to get rid of that. So those who were conscious of this problem, this crisis, that needed to be addressed, Sankara, Cabral, Fanon, Césaire among them, understood that a transformation of consciousness is a component of any qualitative transformation in the foundations of our societies. And they understood that essentially we live a material reality that shapes and affects our interiorities in unexpected ways. They remake the I and the us. Given that, anti-colonial thinkers were interested in how to go about consciousness raising in this period and beyond. I'm just going to quickly focus on two. Fanon privileges embodied experience. Now, this is something that is not readily available to many of us today, but he does say that essentially consciousness is raised as you participate in struggle with others to change your material conditions. He says embodied struggle opens up spheres people never even dreamed of and awakened people's intelligence. So he argues that the only conditions that raise consciousness is collective and agential action within the world, our world, which is still neo-colonial, so as to affect its structures. Now that sounds fantastic, but many of us don't have access to those kinds of conditions today. So I'm interested in Aimé Césaire, a Martinican writer, thinker, and poet, who proposes that short of living embodied struggle, culture is another instrument for transforming consciousness. He says he's not trying to suggest that the artist or writer is a kind of messiah, but he says that textual and visual narrative has a certain ability to blend in the daily round of sufferings and denials of justice, memories and hopes from which people can draw in critical moments. So the idea of narrative as a depository is incredibly interesting. It's not a blueprint, it's not an instruction manual, but it is a depository from which people, in his words, can draw memories and hopes. And actually the continuation of this quote goes, can draw these in critical moments to assault their future. So that militarized term, again, this idea that it is a depository from which we can draw the psychopolitical resources to assault our future. So going by Césaire's idea of what consciousness raising is and what culture offers us for that goal, I want to take us away from what has so far been a rather theoretical and abstract discussion and look closely at one novel and one film. An absolute timeless novel from Aikwe Arma, who published The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born in 1967. It is a seminal post-colonial novel, and it explores disillusionment in post-independence Ghana. We have an unnamed protagonist. He's a railway clerk in Kwame Nkrumah's newly independent Ghana. But what he sees around him is pervasive corruption in society, and he constantly has to deal with whether he refuses it or whether he gives in and pays the personal cost of losing his moral integrity. It's a very fascinating novel. It's hard to capture the very graphic language where Arma talks about sweat, feces, germs, mud, dirt, in order to emphasize themes of decay, corruption, and a kind of existential despair that the character feels, because he often remembers the vivid promise of independence. He says, the promise was beautiful. It was there. So how have we ended up here in a newly independent nation that is already failing to deliver the redistributive promises of decolonization? It offers us no narrative or political resolution, which I'm going to point out as actually one of the aesthetic tools that I think consciousness-raising cultural works do. But the novel still gestures at the conditions from which our consciousness can stem. Embodied experience within one's material conditions. It may seem simple, but essentially he charts his protagonist's understanding of his relation to the neo-colonial economy around him and to other people. And in this sense, he actually suggests that the only way out is through. The only way out is to remain within one's embodied experience and observe the ways in which your material conditions are giving rise to internal dilemmas. There is no way to resist when you begin from a place of what the protagonist calls walking sleepers. You must wake up. And even if you cannot get out of those conditions, he's still a clerk at the end of the book. He hasn't really improved his lot. He has, however, had an internal transformation throughout the book, where he has decided that his integrity and his self-respect is worth preserving. And he must remain in the nitty-gritty of that struggle in order to actually fulfill that decision every single day. So it's a very a novel of internal movement rather than external. I just wanted to share a quote to get a sense of the novel. This internal movement is really nicely encapsulated in this moment where the protagonist is wondering what he should do. He asks, how was the man, which is how the protagonist is referred to throughout, ever going to be able to fight against all the things and all the loved ones who never ceased urging that nothing else mattered, that the way was not important, that the end of life was in the getting of these comfortable things for the self, or if not for the self, then for the loved ones, for the children. So he's struggling throughout the novel with essentially an environment that collectively sanctions the getting of these material, comfortable things, no matter the way. For Neil Lazarus, this kind of dialectic is something between the latent and manifest, the present and the absent. And to go back to that point of, well, what's the consciousness raising aspect of this novel? It's that by our protagonist, we see that only by knowing one's world, by going through to get out, can one ever genuinely aspire to bring about its revolutionary transformation. It's a double lens that our protagonist must live with. And I would add to Lazarus's excellent reading that this kind of knowledge is political consciousness, born of our everyday living conditions and their effects upon our interiority. And as such, as painful as going through rather than around is, it is nevertheless a precursor to any agential and creative political action in our material world. I couldn't help but insert this funny little image because it's the anniversary of the Occupy Gezi protests in Istanbul, which had an explosion of hilarity. It's very relevant to Arma's novel because the two key aesthetic tools that I think he proposes as literary tools of political consciousness is ridicule and criticality. So that's a graffiti from the streets in Istanbul, referring to our still current president and telling him, as in Game of Thrones, that his winter is soon coming. Arma, too, uses parody, satire, tragicomedy, unreliable, sarcastic narration, bitter or pathetic characters, irony, sexual comedy, emasculation, public exposés, disgusting imagery, unflattering mimicry, supernatural, spiritual mischief as literary tools that encapsulate the ridicule that Arma's book suggests must be a component of political consciousness. But also, with that comes criticality. We have a protagonist who's isolated. We get a lot of interior monologue, individual in society themes. We have escapism, imagination, creativity. The protagonist often daydreams. He's dissatisfied. He has a lot of righteous anger that he cannot channel. He desires things that never come about, and he has a perpetual restlessness that is never resolved. It can seem like it's a loop-the-loop kind of method, but actually, alongside ridicule, this criticality becomes two key tools that Arma suggests is an aesthetics of political consciousness. I'm conscious I'm running low on time, but I do think we need a film example, so I'm going to rush through this a little bit. Now, there's more to those aesthetics, though, than ridicule and creativity. And in cinema that essentially got defined as third cinema, we see various other elements that help storytelling have a consciousness-raising bent. This is a 1974 documentary. It was shot by the Lebanese filmmaker Heini Sroor. She also happens to be the first Arab woman to win an award at Cannes. The Hour of Liberation Arrived is a groundbreaking documentary that she shot by actually following the liberation front on the ground in the country, the Arab Gulf country of Oman. And filming their struggle up close. It combines a sense of political urgency with a distinctly feminist lens. She has a lot of moments where Dofari women speak to the camera and talk about their growing literacy and their feelings about being recruited into militant anti-colonial action. The method of her making the story also matters because we have Heini Sroor actually on the ground under RAF bombardment, filming the way the Liberation Front set up makeshift classrooms in the mountains, taught people revolutionary theory, as well as the more practical aspects of guerrilla warfare against the British and the British-backed Sultan based in Muscat. Now, given the ways we talked earlier about the way colonial imagery and visual representations through those mobile cinemas and through that hyper-control over film reduced the colonized subject to an object, we can understand films like Sroor's as an explosive challenge to that definition from Aimé Césaire about colonialism's, quote, skillfully injected mix of fear, inferiority complexes, trepidation, servility, despair, and abasement. The visuals of the film completely explode these things that, as Fanon said, were hammered into the head of the colonized. I'd love to show a short clip here, and I hope this embedded video will work.
من هو اللي يقاوم باستمرار ويمر بالثورة؟ هو الجماهير الفقيرة، الطبقة الفقيرة المسحوقة المغلوبة على أمرها. بالفعل الفكر يقود البندقية. الإنسان الثوري السلاح لا يقوده إطلاقا، من يقوده هو الفكر، يعرف كيف يوجه البندقية ولمن وكيف ولماذا. مشايخ، قبائل، كيف نحلها؟ كيف نقضي عليها؟ هل هو بالعنف العفوي؟ لا، بالعنف الثوري المنظم، العنف المتبنى للفكر الثوري. هل هو بالعنف العفوي؟ لا، بالعنف الثوري المنظم، بالعنف الثوري المنظم.
So we can see a consciousness raising session in action, where the discussion of the day is the difference between spontaneous violence that can further entrench what he calls tribalism and feudalism versus organized revolutionary violence, where one knows why one is picking up the gun and can therefore imagine what comes after the guns are put down. From Sroor's film, I would pull out two additional criteria of an aesthetics of political consciousness: steadfastness and polyphony. In the film, we have interesting temporality. We have a focus on the everyday, ordinary objects and activities, repetition, multi-generational narratives, longue durée histories. The climaxes are often open-ended or subdued. There's waiting, patience, and preserving the routines of life. All elements that, especially in our mainstream cinema or Netflix, as we started with, are completely disposed of nowadays. That repetition, the slow waiting, the recording of corporeal wear and tear in the process of decolonization, which lasts generations. But we also get polyphony. We don't have a hero, a clear protagonist. We get piecemeal contextual insight. Sometimes we get place as character, and we especially get this in Sroor's film, where we have shots of the wonderful landscapes of Dhofar. We often have a national allegory at play, or symbols or objects and rituals that take on the role of a story in themselves. Rarely is there a single hero, as befits anti-colonial revolutionary struggle, but nor is there a certainty about the future. There's only hope of changing conditions today. So there we have it: polyphony, steadfastness, ridicule, and criticality. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well in the discussion about whether you spot more techniques other than these four for an aesthetics of political consciousness. But just to close, why does today's topic matter? Well, we may participate and even implement moves towards decolonizing structures, institutions, ways of relating to one another, but done without political consciousness. That is, without the simultaneous transformation of our everyday lives and our subjectivities. Such proclamations of decolonization may at worst remain tokenistically cultural, and at best just depend on the stamina of a few who will inevitably get burned out. Cultural production, if harnessed for this purpose, can and has been shown in the past to foster and sustain political consciousness. In what I like the contemporary activist group Decolonize the Places way of putting it: maintaining, sustaining an international imagination of anti-imperial feeling. Cultural production doesn't have a blueprint for how to go about this. It doesn't tell us a prescriptive way as to what will come after the success of decolonization. But what it does say is, without the sustenance of an international imagination of anti-imperial feeling, we have material changes that are unfortunately very easy to terminate, reverse, or tokenize. What will be lasting and sustaining is material action in our world that always stems from a state of political consciousness within us. Thank you very much.